Hello everyone, welcome to BIGSOUND, first afternoon. My name's Steve Bell from Street Press Australia. Welcome to Making Records That Matter. I'll introduce you to the panel one by one. On my left I have Nick DiDia.
That's right.
I got it?
Thanks.
Nick's working at Studios 301 at the moment. He's moved down to Byron recently from the States. He's had an amazing career. Worked on albums from artists like Pearl Jam, Bruce Springsteen, Stone Temple Pilots, Neil Young, Mastodon, Rage Against the Machine. Obviously worked really closely with Powderfinger, which is, I assume, why you've ended up at 301.
That's one of the reasons.
Yep. And heaps of other Aussie bands, Charles Kennedy, Living End, Katie Noonan. So welcome Nick, please, to the stage. Thank you. Next to him we've got Scott Horscroft, is Vice President of A&R Australasia, Director of Archangel Sky Management. He's done pretty much everything, producer, manager, A&R, run studios, run the amazingly titled Big Jesus Burger studio, which is sadly defunct, but one of the most incredible...
Not talking about that, right?
Working at Forgotten Valley Music Studio at the moment. He's worked on with so many bands. His company's managing Bleeding Knees, Clubs Millions, Delta Riggs, Goldfields at the moment, so he must be incredibly busy. Welcome, Scott, to the panel, please. Next to Scott's Mr. Ed Kuepper, a man who should need no introduction to any audience in Brisbane. A founding member of the Saints, the Laughing Clowns, recently been in the Bad Seeds, which is just staggering to me. A few weeks ago, it was an honour to see him from side of stage be bestowed the Grant McLennan Lifetime Achievement Award at the Queensland Music Awards. Mr. Ed Kuepper. Next to Ed on his stage left, another guy who should not need too much introduction for Australian audiences, Jeff Martin, obviously founding member and frontman of the Tea Party. 8 albums there. Since then, worked with the Armada, Jeff Martin 777 solo, done a heap of production stuff. He's been incredibly omnipresent in Australia in recent times as an overseas artist because he's been living here, and it's been an absolute privilege for the Aussie scene to have him so close. So thank you very much, Jeff Martin. Down the far end, we've got Steve Schram. Steve is the go-to producer in a lot of the Australian indie circles these days. Worked on some amazing records and is spoken of very highly by bands like Little Red, my good friends the Eagle and the Worm, Clary Brown and Bangin' Rackettes, Little Birdie, Ground Components. Welcome, Steve. So our show always likes to throw in one of these really vague panels each year, and I usually get the honour of facilitating it. Today we're discussing making records that matter. Now obviously with the gents we've got here on stage, they've worked on between them some incredible albums and with some incredible acts. We're not going to just sort of stick to that, just personal experience. We're going to have a chat more about inspiration and great albums and just see where it takes us. So I think I would go, just because you're closest, Nick.
Great. I was hoping to go last so I could just agree with everybody.
Just nod wisely. What to you makes a special album? What's drawn you to music over the journey?
Well, I was thinking about the title, about making records that matter, and I think every record that you make should matter. It matters to you, it matters to the band, whether or not matters to the public in general. There's so many things that record making and what happens with a band when you help them make a record that can either inspire their career to make that great record down the line or to just push further than they've ever pushed to become the band that they're going to become. So I just think there's really not a lot of planning as far as we're going to make a great record this time. Like, we're going to make a record that matters. I don't think I've ever been, that wasn't me, wasn't me. I've never been involved in a record where you started out that way. your goal and your intention is to make a great record, but there's so many other things involved.
Do you have outcomes in mind? Are they sales-oriented, money-oriented, aesthetics? What do you look for?
The outcome to me is to make the best record for the band you can and to help them grow. And you end up growing yourself just working on it. But to me, it's more about just making the best record you can for the band at the time. And hopefully everything else falls into place. It doesn't always. And a lot of times the records that may not be successful commercially end up inspiring other bands, which makes it a record that matters. I mean, there's countless examples of records that people didn't know about when they came out. Blues records are a great example in the US, where there were countless blues records that came out that nobody knew in the US, but everybody in England knew who they were, and it led to the Beatles and the Stones and everybody else. So I just think it's about making a record great while you're making it, and whether it ends up mattering other than to the band there's a lot of things that go into that.
Fantastic. Scott, what's your stance on records that matter? What do you look for?
I think it always comes back to the song, and to the artist, of course, and you know, and the rest is really comes from sort of, I guess, a magical place. I think Ed, being an incredible songwriter, would understand that you know, if there was a formula to this, that we'd all be you know, we'd all be swapping Ferraris. But it's you know, working with incredible artists, I've always noticed that. I mean, Brian Wilson said, you know, you never know when you're going to make a great peanut butter sandwich, so you just keep making as many as you can. And I think that's the case with great records. I mean, you see a band have success with one album and then move on to, you know, their second record, and even though, you know, it's the same artist, still, you know, working with the same practice, sometimes you know, the magic doesn't all come together to project that album to become a great record. And look, you know, I don't know what the answer to that is, but for me, you know, great records comes down to the songs and you know, an artist's practice and what adventure they're on in their, you know, artistic career, and that, you know, has sort of, you know, highs and lows. And I think, you know, sometimes you work with an artist right at the peak of that, and that's when, you know, everything's alight, and I think that's a really magical moment.
So again, it's mainly aesthetics for yourself you look for?
Oh, look, you know, I've worked on so many different records coming from, you know, so many different places. Sometimes it is, you know, you're trying to make a great commercial record, and sometimes, you know, you're working with an avant-garde artist where, you know, adventure and working on new sounds and, you know, working with new technology is the focus, and you're trying to create something that's completely new and adventurous. So I think it changes all the time, and that's the beauty of music, that there are so many different ways you can go, and there's, you know, it's a big open world.
Ed, your turn in the firing line. What do you feel makes a record important?
I don't know, because I've always only ever looked at it from a really, you know, selfish perspective. It's kind of, you know, if I look at other people's records, are they things that, is it something that appeals to me? I don't necessarily find myself drawn to records that are sort of acknowledged classics or anything. You know, there's a wide range of music that I've liked over a long period of time that I think, you know, initially was sort of derided, and, you know, and then in some cases, you know, some decades later, they become classics for whatever reason. And at that stage, you know, because I'm such an elitist sort of swine, I sort of drop them. But from my own point of view, I just go in, if I'm making a record, I just sort of want something that I'm happy with. You know, I can't predict what other people are going to like, and I've never tried. Not that I can recall. And I think, each record also, I think you kind of, it helps in a way if each one challenges you yourself, so that there's kind of an element of maybe falling flat on your face, which is sort of like every record that I've done to some degree. There's a risk of that happening, and I think probably in some cases that has happened, and you just sort of, you learn something from that, and then as the years kind of move on, you look back at those, and you become quite fond of the absolute failures. I mean, they're records that matter to me too. It's not just a thing that's kind of artistically successful, it's also the ones that kind of don't work, and why don't they work, that sort of thing. And a lot of records, half my record collection is probably made up of records that are largely failures, and yet I sort of have a soft spot for them.
Fantastic. Jeff, yourself, what do you look for in either one of your own records or a favourite album by one of your favourite bands? What makes a record special to you?
Special? Well, I think the thing is that, there's as human beings, we have this infinite background of emotion and memories, right? And I think the responsibility that an artist has, no matter what medium you work in, you have a responsibility at getting at that infinite background of emotion and sort of distilling it into something that's perceivable for yourself and possibly, for others as well. And I think that when that's achieved, there's a serenity that comes, a feeling of serenity that comes with that. And then whether or not the art, the piece of art that you've created, whether or not it becomes commercial, it's irrelevant, The most important thing is that if you've successfully done that, so, that alchemical process, I believe that, that's when art, music matters.
Fantastic. And Steve, what do you...
What else is there to say after these guys?
No, what's your feeling, or what do you look for? What inspires you?
What inspires me, the bands that I'm working with. I'm ultimately there for them and to try and articulate their vision. In the terms of what's going to be a great album, and it's going to be great to somebody, whether it's the bass player's mum or somebody's going to dig it. You hope, and you never know if there's going to be that broader appeal there. You look for certain things. You might narrow it down to 2 or 3 songs that you want to lead the charge for the public's perception of the album, but for the bulk of it, you should be able to do whatever you want. If any of us knew the key to what meant, mega selling records, or if I did, I would have come up to Brisbane on my private jet, I wouldn't come with Qantas. But it's that sometimes you're just lucky to be there. When a band is just on fire, you just take a step back and the music just starts sitting a foot out in front of the speakers and you're not doing anything. And that's just beautiful. And you have these little moments, and I remember all of them really fondly. But I haven't made mega million selling records. Most of the records I work on will never get heard, probably never get airplay. It's nice when some of them do. So I can sit here and tell you how great all of these records are that no one's ever heard, and they can't dispute me on that. You're in there and you're so focused on what you're doing and what you're trying to achieve with the band. Making records is a team sport, and great engineers and great producers don't make great records. They help, but great bands and great songwriters make great records. And once it leaves you, it can be out of your hands how the public grabs it and runs with it, and the backing it gets and the support. I'm sure Wally with the Gautier thing, you could never predict I'm going to spend 8 weeks at #1 in the US, So you're in there, you're doing the best that you can, and you're having the most amount of fun that you can, because it's a really fun thing to do. Most of the time, it's a really fun thing to do. You know, sometimes it can get off the rails a bit, but usually you pull it all back together, and you know, and you never know. And I never know how a song's really going to turn out. I got a fair idea, but you know, we could do the one song on the Monday and do the same song on the Thursday, and it'll turn out completely differently. Even when mixing as well, it's all those thousands of little decisions that you make on the fly that ultimately get to somewhere. And the goal for me is, if I've got a happy, smiley band at the end of it, and they love it, and the bass player's mum loves it, then, you know, it's a win for me. So.
It is, it's also subjective. We've got so much experience here amongst us, it'd be crazy not to talk about issues close to home. Nick, you've worked on so many incredible projects. What's the one that stands out to you as making you sort of feel proud to have been part of?
Well, luckily there's a few of those for me. The first Springsteen record I worked on was The Rising, and that was a big deal for me because I'm from New Jersey, so you were made to listen to Bruce Springsteen as a resident of New Jersey growing up, which actually was funny because I ended up not really listening to him when I was a kid because there was so much overexposure, and only came back to his records later when I started doing this and realized the greatness of them. And then, the Rising was a big one for me. And then just working with a guy like that you admire, and then you realize that he just works hard. He's just a really hard worker, and he's constantly trying to get better. So it's really inspiring.
Is the boss a nice guy?
He's a very nice guy. Yeah,
It's good.
very
to know.
nice. But he is the boss.
Yeah, you can imagine.
Scott, same for you, mate.
Far out. Well, I guess for me personally, working with Van Dyke Parks on Young Modern Silverchair album in Prague with the Prague Philharmonic Orchestra was something that blew my mind. Just watching Van Dyke try and communicate with a Czech orchestra when Van Dyke speaks in riddles, and he had a translator, so you'd listen to him. I mean, one of his favourite sayings when he's a little bit confused is "throw the Arab in the limo," and the translator would then have to say that to the orchestra, and they're all like not really getting it. So for me, just meeting an incredible artist and working on an incredible record. I mean, working with Daniel through that process, and having someone like Van Dyke who his work on Smile was a soundtrack to my youth. So that was incredible. Working with Luke Steele, again, another incredible artist. It's just fascinating to go on journeys with him. I mean, they're my two stand out at this point. Yeah.
Fantastic. Ed, you must have a few to choose from.
It's kind of hard to sort of narrow it down because I think there's a number of them. I mean, I haven't really done that much sort of work outside of my own kind of projects. And I suppose the ones that sort of really stick with me are the ones where I feel I've succeeded in kind of reinventing what I do to some degree, which, when I'm on a roll, I think that's kind of every record. And when I get stuck in something, then I have to stop for a while. So if you're asking, memorable moments, I think, the first record that I made is kind of memorable. And, there's been a few that kind of fall into that category for reasons that are significant to me that may not be significant to, the first time I used a horn section on a record, that sort of thing. The first time that I did an all-acoustic record. That, you know, they're sort of memorable moments. Whether they have any significance to anybody else is a completely different issue. You know, it's just, I mean, oftentimes I think, you know, you can possibly find yourself in a situation where you think you're making these significant strides and everybody else kind of thinks, probably realistically, oh, well, it's just the same rubbish that you've been doing for the last 3 years. But, you know, to myself, it has some significance. So, yeah, there's been a few.
Excellent. Jeff, obviously you're in a similar predicament. You've worked on a lot of albums that have done so well. Which one of either yourselves or something you've produced, or what body of work do you feel the most proudest to be a part of?
I'd have to say, if I had to narrow it down, probably be The Edges of Twilight, the Tea Party's second record. That, you know, for a young Canadian band, you know, 23, 24 years old, to come up with a musical statement like that, you know, and you know, it's kind of weird to talk about it because obviously I'm a part of it, big part of it, but hindsight being 2020 and looking at what we achieved with that record and given the climate at that time, you know, 1995, and what was happening in modern rock at that time, you know, The Edges of Twilight was something that was just so coming from a totally different place that no other band was doing, you know, with, and what I mean by that for people that don't know the record is that it was, you know, the Tea Party with its Zeppelin-esque, you know, pomp and circumstance, right? But then all these like a myriad of exotic instruments from India and from the Middle East and Moroccan drums and things like that, and it's all combining with this modern rock music at the time, and it was just a very big statement. It was so exciting, you know. It felt like for us, it was kind of like it was a bit of a Sgt. Pepper's thing going on, you know, because it was like, okay, let's get this instrument now. Let's find this. Let's find that. Let's find that. And A&M Studios in Los Angeles looked like the biggest world music store you've ever seen, you know. And so it was so much fun, so exciting, and you know, it was really sort of the beginning for the band, and the band putting its, I guess, sort of its stamp on things, you know. So very proud moment for me.
But that album got a lot of traction too, but it was the process that you sort of more remember back, and the art itself rather than the traction that it got in and where it took you?
Yeah, no, definitely, because it's, you know, like all the songs in The Edges of Twilight, I mean, you know, if you do the campfire test, you know, when it gets down to it, and it's just an acoustic guitar and a vocal, the song structures are still there, you know. But it was just amazing that, you know, the palette that we had, you know, that I kind of think that it's just because, you know, some of the melodies were inspired by, let's say, Turkish folk music or, you know, Moroccan music or whatever. So using those actual instruments from those parts of the world to reinforce, you know, the statement made it something special.
Fantastic. Stephen, your turn.
I'm stuck on the Arab in the limo. Give me the question again. Memorable or?
Just that makes you sort of, when you look back and reflect, the one that you're happiest to have been a part of, even a little part.
I'm always happy that someone trusts me with their vision and their money, whether it's my little indie bands that turn up with a shoebox full of coins that they've been saving up to make a recording, or someone with a bigger budget. It's a lovely thing that someone trusts you that much. So you're always proud of that in itself, and I'm proud of all of them that when they go out the door. You always feel like you could do something a little better. I'll be shopping in Coles and I hear a song, not that down one, that's not me. And you'll hear something and you go, oh, I shouldn't have done that, or I should have done it like this, or I don't think that ever goes away. Every time I hear something, is that too distorted? No, it's not too distorted, but is there too, you know, should I do this, should I do that? Even ones that do okay is still, there's a little bit of something. And that, I'm really happy that I think like that about them, because then I'm pushing on the next one and pushing on the next one, and you know, you're proudest of what you've most recently done. And then, you're proud to be there when, people are pouring their hearts out, and you get some really nice moments in studios. When you lock yourself in a small room with a group of people for weeks at a time, you make some really strong connections. You might never see them again, but, there's these wonderful things. One was the Art of Fighting album, and Peggy was doing some backing vocals, and she was very, very pregnant. And halfway through the second verse, she just stops and says, "Oh, Steve, I'm having my baby now," and just walked out of the room, through the control room,
Record.
got in the car. It is on tape. And drove herself home, had the baby on the couch, and it's whoa. So there's some memorable moments. That same record was where Claire Bowditch and Marty found out they were having twins as well. So I don't know what was going on in that record. It was cold where we were. We were in a big tin shed.
Do you have that on tape?
No, I don't have that on tape, Scott.
The making of twins on tape. Yes. Yeah.
Well, I must have picked up something, because a couple of years later I had twins myself.
Oh, there you go, man.
Stereo, that's the only way to go.
We'll stay up with you, Stephen. We'll get on to sort of more general topics in a sec, but I'm still curious, stuff that you haven't worked on, then what piece of music inspires you the most, just as a music fan?
Oh, as a music fan, there's probably too many to mention, but ones that inspire me, ones that I feel like I'm sort of connected to from a few degrees of separation. The two guys that took me under their wing and said, "You're going to be a sound engineer," before I even knew what it was, Chris Thompson and Tony Cohen. And together they've made a lot of great records. Chris with the Moodists and the Wave stuff more recently, and Tony with the Cruel Sea and a whole bunch of Bad Seeds albums and stuff. So it's nice to be able to hear those records and talk to those guys about those records, and that sort of inspires me. And something that I was there as an assistant and I saw it going down, even though I wasn't responsible for anything, that in itself, the learning inspires me. And then of course there's your classic albums that you hear, your Sgt. Peppers and whatnot. Everybody's got their own handful of classic albums, and you don't know how they were made, and that in itself inspires you to figure shit out and experiment, because that back then they had these massive limitations on how they could work and put things together, and that was inspiring. So I try to draw from that and take it back and place limitations on the way I work. I generally don't end up with hundreds and hundreds of tracks. It's usually around the 24 mark. I try and keep it as minimal as I can, and it's easier to deal with and mix. But you are more creative. That if you've got the idea of unlimited tracks, you're just throwing it all on there, and then you spend weeks sifting through it, and that is really uninspiring. So keeping it simple is, that inspires me as well, just to try and be minimal and effective, and using as few ideas to create as big an impact as I can. So the records that do that, ones that sort of give me a kick up the bum.
Do you wish you had the opportunity to work in the time where you had to cut the tape and splice it all together?
No, it sounds like
It wasn't that
nightmare.
great.
No, not at all, not at all. And you work with what you got, so, if that's all I knew, then that would be fine. But having the convenience of today's techniques, the equipment, you can apply those old techniques to that and, find a happy ground. But the convenience, once you go to that, I don't feel like I could go back.
Yeah, great. Jeff, what's been inspirational to you as a fan, either recently or growing up, or what is there one particular piece of work?
Well, excuse me. Sgt. Pepper's was definitely something, like as a kid and growing up in, the Windsor, Detroit area in North America, it was pretty much all, just early 70s rock and things like that. But I was, so this would be the early 70s, and I was, 5, 6 years old, and I was really into the early Beatles, because once they started to grow beards, that kind of scared me, But I remember, I think for my 10th birthday, my cousin, who was a little bit older than me and liked to partake in certain things, said that he was going to show me the real Beatles. And he bought me a copy of Sgt. Pepper's for my birthday. And I heard the George Harrison track, Within You, Without You. And that was basically the first time that I heard, Indian, like classical Indian music, right? And something clicked in my young little mind. And it was like, I remembered everything, like things came back, and it was just like this affinity returned. And from that point on, that became one of my biggest passions in music was, exploring, music from different parts of the world and then, bringing it back into rock music and all that stuff. And so yeah, I think that was very much sort of a catalytic moment for me, with Sgt. Pepper's.
Fantastic. Ed, is there anything you can pinpoint that's lit your fire for music?
Oddly enough, or maybe not, I mean the same kind of thing, except for me, because I'm a bit older. I remember, I think I was in grade 1 or grade 2 or something, hearing Love Me Do by the Beatles on the radio the first time. And I just became, that was, at that point, I think I made a decision that I was going to be a musician. And sort of talked my parents into buying me a guitar. My mother wanted me to play piano, which I didn't really, I wish I had have, but I talked them into buying me a guitar. And then from there on, I mean, I sort of grew up as a young kid in the 60s when I think radio was really good. There was always, I mean, you could actually listen to top 40 radio. I suppose, people probably say that all the way through till the 80s or 90s. I don't think anyone would say radio is something that you would listen to passionately these days. But there was a time in the 60s, 70s, and that's as far as I would personally go. I don't think radio was that great in the 80s, but certainly in the 60s it was, an experience. Every week there'd be some absolutely fantastic piece of music that had come out, and quite experimental things. I mean, I was actually never that much of a fan of Sgt. Pepper's, but I Am the Walrus was kind of, that just blew my mind as a kid. That was, the tape collage stuff. I mean, it kind of connected in a way that sort of, it did sort of touch something that was almost sort of genetic or something, and there's a lot of music like that. They were you only got to hear what was on the top 40 radio because I didn't have a record player, but there are a few things. The Monkees I liked. The Monkees were great.
Awesome. Scott?
I guess, there's so many moments that when you, think about your life where you heard something that just absolutely changed your life. I guess one for me was, an early one was Jimi Hendrix. Just, being a drummer when I was younger, seeing Mitch Mitchell play drums was just, you either thought you were going to passionately do it or it was time to give up because he just blew me away. But then, Jimmy, for me, kind of revolutionised what music was, just with noise. And I guess getting into that side of it, it opened me up to experimenting or becoming interested in more noise music. And I remember hearing an Alvin Lucier track where he made music out of squeaking doors. It sounded like John Coltrane recording. There was so much work being put into splicing these squeaking doors together to make like a saxophone solo. And just, for me, that just opened up this world of that, making music just wasn't about writing songs. It was about art. It was about concept as well as great songs. So that really changed things for me. And having this lecturer named Douglas Kahn, who was a professor in sound art and found sound music, and learning about Lamont Young and John Cage and that whole side of things. I think that was a big inspiration to me. But I guess these days, again, going back to the Beach Boys for me, again, introduced me to harmony and seeing the sort of transition from being a pop band, doing sort of radio hits, and then Brian going off into a more of an experimental place, I thought was really exciting. And I guess these days, just things that are really pushing it with technology, and I guess lots happening in dance music with, dubstep and those sort of sounds coming into popular culture. That really excites me, and I think it's inspiring. Like a young artist named Madian, a French DJ composer, just listening to how he puts things together. I mean, it's boggling to think how a young kid of sort of 17 can put this stuff together. So, still being inspired all the time, and I think pushing the boundaries with technology, trying new things. I'm always inspired by that.
Fantastic. Nick, is there any one particular thing or field that's inspired you?
Well, I was thinking about this the other day. I've gone back and I'll pick a classic record, and I like to listen to the record before that. So for Springsteen, for me, Born to Run would be my number one. But if you listen to Wild and the Innocent, which is the record preceding it, with hindsight again, you hear what's about to happen. There's a lot of other records like maybe the Bends from Radiohead, which for a lot of people that's their number one record. I'm an OK Computer fan. Sometimes it's very divided between people, but to me the Bends was such a jump from their first record, and you just heard that something was about to happen. And it's exciting for me when I get calls to work for bands, that when you hear their music, and they're bands who've already made a couple records, and you hear that these guys are ready to make that jump, and you just want to be part of that because it's just really exciting and fun and great.
So listening to those records in hindsight, knowing what came afterwards, that changes your appreciation of it as compared to how you would listen to it on the day it came out?
I think so. For me, it does, because there's so many circumstances that go into making a classic record that aren't just obviously songwriting and talent and hard work. There's a lot of timing, there's a lot of luck, for all those things to make those records that are the classic records that everybody knows. And I think that when you're listening to the record before, you want to be a fan. Peter Gabriel's another one for me, where I would hear his record, and for me, his first four solo records were just really, each one was completely different, and in a different way, didn't give any clue about what was going to happen next. And for me, that's why he's such a special artist to me, that it was so unpredictable. But I think for some of the other bands, you just hear this progression between where they were, where they are, and then the promise of what's about to happen next. And it's fun to go back now and you listen to them, and you can really pick it out. Pink Floyd's Metal, and actually Adam Hart Mother and Metal, which preceded Dark Side of the Moon, you can hear that, the progression, that something great is about to happen. So.
I often think about that first time when you listen to a record and how not knowing what is about to come gives you a whole different frame of reference. Like a part that seems so innocuous is building up to something amazing, and if you don't know that's coming, it's a whole different way of listening.
Well, and great records really have a depth to them that changes over time. The things you heard at the beginning, I heard a great quote from Robert Fripp, who said that for him, the Beatles, the first time you listened to the song, you heard the melody. The sixth time you listened to it, you heard the lyrics. And the 20th time you listened to it, you heard the guitar panning back and forth. And it was it just showed, especially with those records, how deep they were, and as a producer, that's the kind of record you want to make, that connects with people on so many levels. The technology doesn't get in the way, but it can also be appreciated later.
I'll throw this one open just to the group in general. When so much has been made these days about the changing musical landscape, whether it be how records are made or how they're disseminated, it's all changing. There's a lot of flux and people are obviously trying to work out what's going to happen next. But at the end of the day, you guys are going to be working on and writing and making great albums, and geeks like me are going to be still getting access to the music. Do you think it's really changed that much in its core? Like music, what makes a great record it's not going to change it.
I think it's just, probably everybody would agree, it starts with the song. I mean, the songs are great. They have to be. I don't think any classic great record has shitty songs on it. I mean, a lot of it, a lot of the other stuff can change, but it has to be a great song. And then timing and everything else plays into it. But I think it starts there. So no matter what changes underneath, I think people still are going to respond to great songs first. What they sound like or how they're put together can vary.
Yeah, that's the campfire test that Jeff was talking about. If it's great on an acoustic guitar or just a piano and vocal, and all the other frilly fluff that we do, it's still a great song, We just try and help it.
You're selling us short.
Well, we're the translators, yes. And we try and make it work out of little speakers this big, or laptop speakers now, or the mono one on the Unearthed website, or the mono one off your iPhone. It's we're there to try and grab that and make it work in a lot of formats. But if you don't have the great song, then there's probably a lot of really amazing sounding shit records out there. If you don't have that song, then you don't have anything.
Does the car test still work in this day and age? Do you run out from the studio and chuck it in your car?
Don't cut out the bass when you're in the car.
Well, what about you, Ed? Looking forward, do you see like there being no need to change your mindset in terms of creating? And
Well, one thing that I sort of slightly disagree with. I mean, I understand the notion of the song that can work on an acoustic guitar, but what about the musical creation that is equally valid, that is, made by 3 tape decks or something, which you can't actually set up around the campfire because you haven't got electricity. You can still kind of make valid music without it being something that can be performed in every environment. For instance, if you're talking about modern electronic music, you can't do that with an acoustic
Hard to
guitar.
play a club banger on the acoustic guitar. Isn't it?
So I'm just saying it to be contrary, basically. But I don't know, as far as things have sort of changed, except in a way they're kind of back to where they were when I started out. I mean, basically it started with singles. Basically one song was what drew people to what you were doing. And if you kind of do a single, people wouldn't buy an album because they were expensive when I was a youngster, you just wouldn't. And in fact, a lot of albums weren't that good because they were basically just padding to sort of sell records, on the strength of a couple of 45s, basically. So we're sort of back to that, not through choice, but just, not through the artist's choice necessarily, but, people now can just pick and choose what they want. And so there's been this shift away from the LP, the long-playing record, to some degree. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. I like the idea of an album personally, so I'm going to keep making them, if, whether people buy them or not. But I like the idea of that. So no, I actually, the more things kind of move on in that way, the more sort of old-fashioned I think I'm going to become.
Jeff, what about yourself? Well, do you have a different mindset now moving forward, or is it still just creating is in of itself the main priority?
Yeah, it's the creative process is the main priority for me, and for the artists I work with as well. It's, I still believe in that the journey of the album, because there's, yes, you can say so much in one song, but I do believe that the collections, the collection of songs for a particular period of time for an artist, right, is something really special. And there's a story that's in it. It's not a concept record or anything like that. We're not going to go all prog rock, right? But it's just that these collections of songs at a moment in time in an artist's life, right? It really does weave a story in and out amongst itself, and I think that that's the thing that I love to explore, in my work and the work that I do as a producer for the artists that I produce. So that's what I have to say about that.
If people are just, a lot of people have got clouds and what have you now, there's a million different ways of accessing music. If people are just cherry picking one song here and there, is that a problem for you? Would you rather the album be listened to?
It's just a reality, but I feel that they're missing out, but that is the reality of this day and age, and, people want the immediacy of things, and maybe the attention span isn't there, but I don't know, maybe it's just blind faith or something like that, right? But I want to keep on believing that, it's important, so
Yeah,
it needs to be there so that, if they have the choice and if something really captures, their imagination, then there you go, there's the whole story.
Nick, are you of the belief that the album will still have validity moving forward?
I hope so. I think it will. I mean, again, the single is the thing that might catch someone's attention at first, but the idea is that they want to listen to more of that person who made that song, and I think that's where the album comes in. So I don't necessarily think that's going to go away. It's going to shift in how, I think musically, it hasn't changed. How music is sold has changed dramatically. I think how music is made, everyone's using what's available, which is what they did in the 60s. They used what was there, and a lot of it was cutting edge technology at the time. So that part, it's a way of monetizing it, I think. So I don't know if I still buy records. So I'm holding on.
All right, we've got about 10 minutes left, so I would love to throw it to the floor. Can we grab a bit of house lights and some mics? All right, we've got one hand shoot up over there. Hang on, just wait a sec, we'll get a mic over for you.
There's so much talent on the stage here. I'm just wondering, I'm sure you're all admirers of each other's work or parts thereof. Have you got any questions for each other? Is there anything you guys as producers want to ask?
I think we should form a super band.
I'm with you. I'll play tambo.
Yeah.
Oh, that's more.
I'm the singer.
That's a lot of producers in the room. I'm not sure that's going to work out. Too many cooks.
Imagine trying to put the kick drum mic right.
Is there any one of you guys got something you're curious about one of the others?
Yeah, definitely, but I don't want to go all gooey at the knees up here in front of everybody.
I'll wait till 11 o'clock tonight.
Nick's done just, mind-boggling stuff. So Scott, it's crazy, and Ed and Jeff, I've listened to everybody here. I've heard their work, all of them. It's really daunting. It's ridiculous. Having a ball, but no, I'll be asking more questions as soon as we get off here because I don't want to seem like that little fanboy up here.
Ed, where was your first record made? Do you remember what the gear was?
I can remember the guitar amplifier.
Right.
I don't remember what the disc was. I think it was a 16-track something or other. Recorded here in Brisbane at a small studio that I don't think exists anymore.
All the good ones go.
Well, yeah. whatever sort of console they had in studios, we were in and out in about 3 or 4 hours sort of thing. It was, first time in, it was kind of all a bit magical, really. And I was happy with the results.
It could be a good juncture to introduce Mr. Moffat over here.
Oh, there it is. This is
Worked with Ed on a lot of those early recordings, or some of those early recordings. You guys, is it true? You guys haven't sort of hooked up since?
No, I don't think we've been in the same room that I can remember since that night.
no, probably not.
What happened that night?
How you doing?
Hey Ed, how are you?
They got
What was
something-
the desk?
Yeah,
What
so
was the
what was
console?
it?
Sorry?
What was the console?
It was a custom-built
Right.
Brisbane-made console.
See, that's why I couldn't remember.
Yeah, and an Ampex MM1100 tape machine.
Yeah, awesome.
Okay.
History in the making. Questions? Just wait up 1 second.
So where do you think the music industry is going to be heading within the next 5 to 10 years? Like, some people say that festivals are slowly dying out and more the live personal performances are coming back in. What's your personal opinion?
Anyone got to
I'm
take a
totally unqualified to answer that one.
I couldn't actually hear you very well. Could you say that again?
Just saying, do you think there's a change in the festivals being the sort of dominant paradigm for people to play live?
I think, that historically, there's a shift where, one festival works really well, then someone else jumps in, makes another festival, and before you know it, every man and their dog's starting a festival. And they become boring, and then all of a sudden, live venues start to shut, and everyone's going to the club, and then everyone gets bored of the club, and then, it just moves around back and forth. I think, as we're talking about singles and albums, I think, that's always going to continuously shift. So, I mean, we've definitely been swamped with the mega festivals over the last couple of years. So, I mean, Stereosonic was the biggest festival we've ever had last year on one sitting of 75,000 people or whatever. So, I think we're in the heyday of the big festival. To think that it's declining at this point. Last year was a record year. So, for dance music, but maybe, maybe for rock and roll, it is going back to those sort of more intimate shows. People want that intimacy with the artist rather than the festival experience. But I think, it twos and fro's. I think we're not going to. People want to see music. People want to connect with the artist. So we'll always have some form of that.
I think for the really sort of hardcore fans, festivals, I just wouldn't go. I wouldn't pay the money. I wouldn't go to see somebody in that sort of environment. It really yields nothing apart from like having a list of I've seen blah blah blah, But in terms of actually kind of, as an audience member interacting with the band, if the room's much more than 1,000 or 2,000 people, you may as well just watch it on TV, I think.
If one of your favourite bands is going to come out every 2 or 3 years only, you want to see 2 hours, not 40 minutes.
Yeah.
Well, there's that side of it too, but I just mean in terms of, the size. Like, really, if you're in these sort of really large auditoriums, it is, if you can't see the act on stage, what's the point? And usually the sound isn't that great anyway, Save your money.
Questions? We've got one over here at the back. Is that Adele?
Thanks. Hello. Hi, guys. I was just wondering, regarding female engineers and producers in Australia, do we have a history? Is there any, I'm just curious.
No.
I know, it's a question of kind of
I mean,
thought
so I
about.
could see JP sitting in the audience, who worked with me at Big Jesus Burger for a long time. We used to constantly try and give opportunities and constantly push to have female assistants and female engineers, and really push to try and develop their careers. I don't know what it is, sitting in a room with a smelly bunch of blokes for 14 hours a day, maybe? Bit of a turn off.
My engineer I use a lot, Anna Webster, she's wonderful.
Fantastic. She's awesome. Yeah.
And I talk about it with her, and she thinks that it's not interesting. I don't know. It's quite odd, because I think that what we do is quite feminine and quite delicate. We're softly a lot of the time, and we're just gently shaping things. And
There's a lot of massaging.
yeah, it's all massaging. That's it. You're just gently getting it in there. That totally came out wrong. That's probably why. There's your answer right there. But I don't know if they're interested. I don't know any that are really. I don't know a lot that are really interested.
Because you do hear, I mean, with film and editing, there's a lot of female or TV editors. So it's not the technology that I don't think. I just.
And maybe it's the visual versus the audio, or I don't know, because Anna's amazing. It's wonderful.
It's a mystery. We don't have an answer.
No.
Yeah.
All right.
I think
Great question, though.
I'm the usher here, but I also work on festivals a fair bit as a stage manager and stuff. And I've seen more and more stage techs and backline techs and also monitors techs who are women now coming up. So I think it's
The revolution.
in the future. And I think it's also a bit nerdy. Maybe there aren't so many. So it's the massaging as well as there's that little bit of nerdiness.
What are you saying? What are you trying to say?
I mean that in a nice way.
This is slowly turning erotic.
Questions? Here in the front row. Oh, no, hang on. We'll get to you next minute.
Yeah, it's totally nerdy. No matter how much I try and escape that.
Sorry. Just curious, what do you guys think of Spotify?
I love it.
Yeah, Scott, you should take that.
Being able to just jump online and listen to any record that you've heard about, or it's a great tool to just investigate and hear all those great records that you've always wanted to hear, and they're all there. It's a new, easy medium for artists to get paid, which I think any way that we can try and tackle piracy, we have to keep coming up with ways of tackling piracy, because, it's everyone here is, all musicians work so hard to make records, and just to feel that for some reason we're excluded from laws of stealing just boggles my mind. So having something that I think, is really easy, because us as humans love things that are easy, that gets money back to the artist, I think it's a great thing.
Fantastic.
It's a pretty small amount of money, though.
Yeah, it is. I mean, but I think it's
I don't know. I kind of feel a bit ambivalent about Spotify, and I think there's it's kind of too easy in a way. I actually prefer making it hard for people to hear things.
But the thing is, they don't. They just, they just steal.
Having everything available, kind of, it's an alien thing to me, because when I was growing up, you had to actually kind of really search for stuff and take a few chances, and go through tons of junk shops and buy things that you hadn't, cheap of course, but because you like the cover, or because you might recognise a name of somebody that had been on another record or something. There's sort of I think I remember those records, whereas I wonder if I sort of go through Spotify, there's kind of like, how do you sort of, just do you randomly just go through everything?
Yeah,
that's
I mean,
on
for
the
me it is.
playlist?
It's like a tool like that,
Yeah.
that doesn't take away the art of finding records. It's another new thing.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to appear like a total sort of Luddite, but I think there's too much music, and I think there should be less of it. Yeah. and you shouldn't listen to Spotify.
Just one last question, Ray. You had one here. Can we bring the mic up the front, please? So. All right, we'll get that. We'll do two more.
You guys were talking a lot about great songs and albums from probably before I was born. I'd be interested to know is there any songs in the last 12 months that have really stuck out to you and struck a chord with you as far as songwriting goes?
Last 12 months.
Good question.
Problem is that probably most of us have been stuck in a studio for the last 12 months.
Listen to the same song.
I listen to talkback radio after work or nothing. That's kind of it. No, they were bombarded with Spotify, so it's hard to, it's too much music. There must be. I'm sure there must be. I'm just struggling to think. And I'm hopeless with names of songs. That's always, because we deal with so many songs all the time. I never remember.
Yeah, I like track 2 on that
Yeah,
record.
or when I'm talking with the
cover,
band,
yeah.
the one that goes,
You
hey,
never ask an engineer about music.
we hate it. I hate bands.
And it is hard to, for me, it's hard to listen to music while you're working on music a lot, or I just turn on a classical station just because I cannot listen, but it's just there for me. But with that said, for me, the Gaslight Anthem is a band that I'm lucky enough to work with and is a really exciting new band. Much like the bands that I mentioned earlier. But again, I don't know if I wasn't working on it, if I would have listened to it and known about it as much as I do. So.
And see, I love the Black Keys Brothers album, but I'm not sure if I like it for the songs or the sound of that record. I think it's the sound that keeps pulling me in. I think we start to hear things differently and appreciate things differently, and sometimes we're listening for different aspects. It sort of killed. I used to be able to rattle on all day before I started doing this what my favorite records were and why, and now I've got no idea what they are anymore.
It's hard to listen without analyzing something.
Yeah, it is.
I would have done that, or why didn't I do that? Especially on records you didn't do. Why didn't I do that? I got to steal that for next time.
I think one of the other things that happens once you've been doing it for a little while is that a lot of the sort of mystery kind of goes out of it, and you kind of hear new records in a different sort of way. Quite possibly, if I had have heard them when I was 15 or something, I would have thought, great, and to be perfectly honest, these days, no, I don't hear that much that really kind of knocks me out. Occasionally, but I'd be lying and trying to sort of pander to a youth market. But to be honest, I don't. It just doesn't appeal.
Yeah, that's a good point. And hearing, Jimi Hendrix backwards guitar, and it's just like mind blowing when you first heard it, and then you hear something backwards today, and you push that button.
All right, we're just about out of time. There was one last question at the back, I believe.
Hello, yeah. Just when you're producing a record, where do you draw the line between producing it and getting a writing credit on it?
It's a good question.
Yeah, great question. If you feel like you've really contributed, lyric is the obvious one. There's some old saying of write a word, take a third. But it's that's the obvious one. Melody, but we're paid to arrange and it's a really tough one, but the massage is.
It used to be sort of more straightforward in the old days because you would have somebody doing an arrangement, which when you hear what some arrangers did with a basic song, you could quite strongly advocate that they should be given a writer's credit, but they're not because they're employed as an arranger.
That's right.
If, for instance, you're doing a kind of a dance record or something and you put you work on the beat part of it, I mean, technically that's not even, recognised in old language as being part of the song. So whatever you can kind of get, really, you can bully the band into thinking you did a lot then.
For me, I've always tried to define what's happening on that day.
Yeah.
If I go into a session to write, then I'll make sure that the lines are clear that we're writing on that day. But if I'm going in there to produce, usually I will contribute to writing, but it's just such a tricky situation that I'll stay clear of wanting to go into that, discussions about small, minute parts of points. I just think it opens up a bag of worms unless you are actively doing a writing session with a band, because the lines blur, and if you're not going to hold back a great idea that you've got as a producer, you're gonna put it in the pot. But,
Nick, did you ask the boss for points?
No, I didn't. I doubt he would have given them to me anyway. And that's usually, my rule of that is, it is your job as a producer to make the song the best it can be for the artist. If the artist feels like giving you a piece of that, then yeah, thanks. But it would never be, it's just part of the job to me.
Yeah, that was a great question.
Historically, there are some, especially if you go back to the 50s and 60s, there's a lot of producers who get co-credits. Like if you look at Buddy Holly records, Norman Petty gets significant writing credits. It's argued by people that were around that he was actually just able to do it because it was his studio and his record label at the time. So there's especially on old blues records, there's tons of record label owners that have co-written every blues classic that's ever been written,
And radio DJs, they would give
radio DJs,
songwriting credit to
Elvis
get them to
as
play
well.
it.
Well, guys, look, we're out of time. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap this up. Thank you so much, fellas, for coming. But thank you so much, Steve, Jeff, Ed, Scott, and Nick. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, guys.